It's Marple and the widow with the glass eye. Good evening, friends, and welcome to another mystery here on Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Alie, and I'm so glad you're here. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what kind of weather is keeping you company tonight. Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for new stories each day. Now let's begin tonight's adventure. Chapter 1. Tea at Ivy Cottage. The gray November afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular quality of stillness that promises rain before nightfall. Miss Marple, making her way along the high street with her shopping basket, paused to admire the chrysanthemums in Mrs. Ashcombe's front garden. They were bronze and gold, defiant against the gray sky, arranged in earthenware jars on either side of the green front door of Ivy Cottage. The cottage itself was one of the prettier dwellings in the village, with its fresh white paint and neat window boxes. It had been the home of Mrs. Lydia Ashcombe for some 15 years now, ever since her husband had died and left her a modest independence. Miss Marple had always thought Mrs. Ashcombe a woman of particular dignity and composure, the sort who had faced trouble with a steady hand and a level head, as if summoned by thought. The green door opened and Mrs. Ashcombe herself appeared on the threshold. She was a woman in her early 50s, slim and upright, with iron gray hair, dressed simply but well. Her right eye, as everyone in the village knew, was glass, a relic of the Blitz when a window had shattered during a raid. She wore it with such discretion that strangers rarely noticed, though occasionally the light would catch it at an angle that revealed its unchanging quality. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashcombe called out, and there was something in her voice, some tightness, that made the older woman look up sharply. "How fortunate. I wonder if you might do me the very great favor of joining us for tea this afternoon. I find myself in need of a sensible witness." "A witness, my dear?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ashcombe's composed face showed the faintest flicker of something that might have been distress. "My late husband's brother, Basil Ashcombe, is coming at 4 o'clock. There is to be what he calls a rent committee discussion. He has certain ideas about rationalizing his properties in the village." Her lips compressed slightly. "I thought it would be wise to have friends present." Miss Marple understood at once. Basil Ashcombe was not popular in St. Mary Mead. He owned several cottages in the vicinity and had a reputation for inquisitiveness that stopped just short of outright cruelty. "Only just short," some said. "I should be delighted," Miss Marple said warmly. "Shall I bring Lady Bantry? Dolly has been wanting to call." A look of genuine relief crossed Mrs. Ashcombe's face. "You are very kind." By 3, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry were settled in the sitting room of Ivy Cottage, a pleasant room with chintz curtains and a coal fire burning cheerfully in the grate. The room smelled of beeswax and chrysanthemums. Mrs. Ashcombe moved about with quiet efficiency, setting out her best china and arranging a plate of seed cake. "I must say, Lydia, you are looking tired," Lady Bantry observed with the privilege of old friendship. "Is that I troubling you again?" Mrs. Ashcombe touched her right temple with a fleeting gesture. "A little, the change in weather, perhaps. It becomes tiresome when I'm anxious." Before Lady Bantry could pursue this interesting admission, there was a commotion at the garden gate. A motor-car door slammed with unnecessary violence, and heavy footsteps crunched up the gravel path. Basil Ashcombe did not knock so much as announce himself. He was a thick-set man in his late 50s, florid of face and loud of voice, dressed in tweeds that had seen better days. Behind him came Mr. Pritchard, the estate agent from Much Benham, a smooth man with sleek dark hair and an obsequious manner that Miss Marple had always distrusted. "Afternoon, Lydia," Basil Ashcombe said, barely glancing at the other occupants of the room. "I see you've got up a committee of your own. Well, no matter. Business is business." He threw himself into the best armchair without invitation and pulled a sheaf of papers from his inside pocket. "I have drawn up a new lease. Pritchard here has been advising me. The rent will be increased by 30%. And there are certain conditions about improvements you will be expected to make. Garden maintenance, fresh paint, that sort of thing. Mrs. Ashcombe remained standing by the tea tray. Her voice was perfectly level. I see. And if I'm unable to meet these conditions, then we shall have to discuss alternative arrangements. His tone made it clear what those arrangements would be. There was a small, tense silence. Miss Marple observed the scene with her bright, bird-like eyes. She noticed that Mrs. Ashcombe's right hand had gone to her eye, pressing lightly at the lid. She noticed, too, that Martha Keene, Mrs. Ashcombe's part-time charwoman, had appeared in the doorway with a tea tray, her pleasant face creased with worry. Perhaps we might have tea first, Mrs. Ashcombe said quietly. Martha has just made a fresh pot. Ta! Basil Ashcombe looked as though he might refuse, then shrugged. Oh, very well. 5 minutes won't make any difference. Martha set down the tray with hands that trembled slightly. She was a hard-looking woman in her 40s, treasurer of the Women's Institute and mother of 3. Everyone knew that she depended on her work at various houses in the village to make ends meet. There is one other matter, Basil Ashcombe continued, reaching for a cup without thanks. Young Mrs. Hope in Lurnham Cottage. The baby keeps crying at night, I'm told. Disturbs the other tenants. I have decided she must go. You cannot turn out a young mother with an infant, Lady Bantry said sharply. It would be monstrous. I can do as I like with my own property, your ladyship. His tone was not quite insolent, but it bordered on it. Mrs. Ashcombe had gone very still. Basil, surely there is room for compassion. Millie Hope is a widow. Her husband was killed in Korea. She has nowhere else to go. Not my concern. He gulped his tea and set down the cup with a clatter. Now then, I want 5 minutes quiet to read over these papers properly. Is there somewhere I can sit undisturbed? The morning parlor, Mrs. Ashcombe said after a brief pause. Her hand went again to her right eye, and Miss Marple saw her blink several times, as though the eye were indeed troubling her. Through there, you will not be disturbed. Basil heaved himself to his feet and stumped across the hall to the morning parlor, the papers clutched in one thick hand. They heard the door close firmly behind him. Mrs. Ashcombe stood quite still for a moment, her face very pale. Then she turned to Martha. Martha, I am so sorry to trouble you, but my eye is being tiresome this afternoon. Would you be so good as to fetch my eye bath from the bedroom? It is in the velvet case on my dressing table. Of course, madam. Martha set down the teapot and hurried away. Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat. I shall wait at the garden gate, he announced to no one in particular. Mr. Ashcombe will call me when he is ready. He let himself out through the front door. In the sitting room, the fire crackled softly. Lady Bantry poured more tea with a grim expression. That man is a bully and a brute. Yes, Mrs. Ashcombe agreed quietly. She had taken her seat at last, her hands folded in her lap. Yes, he is. Miss Marple said nothing, but her needles clicked steadily as she knitted, and her eyes were very thoughtful indeed. 10 minutes passed. The tea grew cold in the pot. Martha returned with the eye bath and was sent to the kitchen to prepare fresh tea. Mr. Pritchard could be seen through the window, smoking by the garden gate, and from the morning parlor came no sound at all. It was Lady Bantry who spoke first. Surely he has had long enough. Lydia, shall I knock? Mrs. Ashcombe rose and crossed to the parlor door. She tried the handle and frowned. It seems to be locked or bolted. She knocked lightly. Basil, we're ready to continue if you are. No answer came. Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful precision. In her long experience, locked doors and silence were never a good combination. I think, she said gently, that perhaps we'd better fetch Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack. Chapter 2. A Locked Parlor and a Fallen Mirror. Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes, driven by young Constable Palk in the police car. He was a man of middle age with a permanently irritated expression, and he had learned over the years, much against his will, that when Miss Marple suggested something might be amiss, it generally was. Dr. Haydock came on his heels, having been fortuitously making a call at the vicarage. He was a brisk, gray-haired man with keen eyes and a matter-of-fact manner that inspired confidence. "Now then," Slack said, positioning himself before the morning parlor door. "Mr. Basil Ashcombe went in here, you say, Mrs. Ashcombe?" "At 5 minutes to 4, Lydia Ashcombe replied. Her composure had returned, though Miss Marple noted that her right hand occasionally strayed to her temple, as though the glass eye were causing discomfort. He wished to read some papers in private. Slack tried the handle. The door remained firmly shut. He bent to examine the keyhole, then straightened with a grunt. "Key's in the lock on the inside, and I can see the bolt is shot as well." He rapped sharply on the panel. "Mr. Ashcombe, please open this door if you please." Silence answered him. "Is there another way in?" he asked. "The French window," Mrs. Ashcombe said quietly. "It opens onto the side garden." They trooped outside into the gray afternoon, their feet crunching on the gravel path that ran along the cottage's flank. The side garden was narrow and tidy, bordered by a neat hedge. The French window of the morning parlor stood before them, its curtains only partially drawn. Slack pressed his face to the glass, shading his eyes against the reflection. What he saw made him stiffen. "Get back, ladies. Dr. Haydock, you'd better look at this." But Miss Marple, who had never been good at being ordered about, had already moved forward. Through the glass she could see into the small, elegant parlor with its striped wallpaper and mahogany furniture, and on the floor beneath what had once been a handsome convex mirror with an eagle crest lay the crumpled form of Basil Ashcombe. The mirror itself, which must have hung above the fireplace, now rested partly on the body and partly on the carpet. Its heavy gilt frame was cracked, and the convex glass had shattered into wicked shards that caught the light like scattered diamonds. "Locked from inside," Slack muttered. "Latched, too, by the look of it." He examined the French window's catch. "We'll have to force it." It took several minutes of careful work with a penknife to slide back the latch without breaking the glass. The window swung inward at last, and Dr. Haydock stepped inside with professional swiftness, kneeling beside the prone figure. His examination was brief. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "Dead, I'm afraid. Skull fractured. The mirror must have fallen directly onto him." "Fallen?" Slack's voice was sharp with suspicion. "So it would appear." Haydock stood, brushing dust from his trouser knees. "The picture cord has given way. See, both ends are hanging there." He pointed to the wall above the mantelpiece where 2 frayed lengths of cord dangled from an ornate brass hook. Miss Marple had entered behind them, moving with surprising quietness for an elderly lady. She stood just inside the doorway, her head tilted slightly, taking in the scene with those deceptively mild blue eyes. The room was perhaps 12 feet square, paneled in oak halfway up the walls. The fireplace was of white marble, and a small coal fire burned in the grate, lending warmth to the chill afternoon. The mantelpiece held several ornaments, a small clock that had stopped at 3 minutes past 4, and toward the back, almost hidden by a china shepherd, a shallow saucer. Basil Ashcombe lay on his back, one arm flung out, the other pinned beneath the mirror's frame. His eyes were open and staring. There was surprisingly little blood, just a dark stain matting the hair at the back of his head where it had struck the floor or been struck. "Accidental death," Slack said, though he sounded uncertain. "Must be. Room locked from the inside, window latched." He bolted himself in to read those papers. The mirror fell, and that was that. "The papers," Lady Bantry said from the doorway where she had remained with Mrs. Ashcombe. "Where are they?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. She looked about the room carefully. There was no sign of the sheaf of documents Basil Ashcombe had carried in with him. Perhaps they slid under something when he fell, Haydock suggested, but a search of the room revealed nothing. The papers had vanished. Could he have put them in his pocket? Constable Polk offered. Slack, with some distaste, felt through the dead man's jacket. He produced a wallet, a packet of cigarettes, and a box of matches, but no papers. Odd, he admitted grudgingly. Miss Marple had moved to the fireplace. She stood looking up at the hook from which the mirror had hung. It was a substantial fitting, screwed deep into the wall above the mantel. The two lengths of picture cord hung down like broken reins, swaying slightly in the draft from the open French window. "May I?" she asked, and without waiting for permission, she reached up with her gloved hand. The left-hand cord she examined first. Its end was frayed in the ordinary way of old rope, the fibers separating naturally from long wear and strain. But the right-hand cord was different. Its end was cleaner somehow, almost glossy, and the individual strands seemed stuck together. "Inspector," she said softly, "would you look at this, please?" Slack came over with poor grace. "What am I looking at?" "The two ends of the cord. Do you not think they are rather different from one another?" Slack peered at them. One's older than the other, perhaps. Different pieces of cord joined together. What of it? "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "if they were joined, and the join gave way, should there not be some mark of that joining? A knot, perhaps, or the remains of wire or thread?" She was right, of course. There was no sign of any fastening between the two lengths of cord. Dr. Haydock had come to look as well. "You're thinking this was not an accident, Miss Marple?" "I am thinking," she replied carefully, "that it is very strange." Her eye had caught something else now. On the brass hook itself, just visible at its upper curve, was a tiny bead of something clear and hardened. She touched it delicately with one fingertip, then brought her hand away and rubbed thumb and finger together. They stuck just slightly before separating. "Sugar," she said thoughtfully, "or something very like it." "Sugar? What has sugar to do with anything?" Lady Bantry had come into the room now, supporting Mrs. Ashcombe, who looked as though she might faint. Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she turned to the mantelpiece and, with great care, lifted the shallow saucer that sat near the back. Its surface was dusted with hard, translucent grains, and the rim was distinctly tacky to the touch. "Oh," Mrs. Ashcombe said faintly, "that is mine, I am afraid. I brought it in earlier with some hot water for my eye. The bath, you know, I must have left it there. For your eye?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle but interested. "Yes, I have been having some discomfort today. I warmed a little water with a pinch of boric powder and rested the saucer on the mantel while the eye bath cooled enough to use." She touched her right eye with a trembling hand. "It is nothing serious." Miss Marple set down the saucer very carefully and glanced once more at the hook, at the two different cords, at the small clear bead that might or might not be sugar. "Dr. Haydock," she said, "would you say that the mirror fell just now or some little time ago?" Haydock considered. Death would have been instantaneous or very nearly so. "I would estimate it occurred between 10 and 15 minutes ago, say 5 to 10 past 4. "And yet the fire is still burning quite warmly," Miss Marple observed, "as though it had been tended recently. And see, Inspector, there is a faint mark here under the crest of the mirror where it hung." She indicated a small, shiny smear on the wallpaper above the mantel. Slack was beginning to look harassed. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I am suggesting nothing as yet," she replied. "But I do think we should examine this room very carefully indeed. And perhaps, Inspector, you might ask Mr. Pritchard what he observed while he was waiting at the garden gate, and where Martha Keene went when she left the house. Small details often prove illuminating." She moved toward the door where something had caught her eye. Running her gloved finger along the outer top edge of the doorframe, she paused, then held up her hand. Her gray glove showed a faint dark smear like grease or graphite. "Most curious," she murmured. "Most curious indeed." Inspector Slack looked from the body to the broken mirror to the peculiar smear on Miss Marple's glove, and his expression suggested that his afternoon had become considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. "Right," he said grimly. "Nobody leaves this house until I say so. Polk, fetch your notebook. We're going to take statements from everyone." And Miss Marple, folding her hands over her handbag, nodded with quiet satisfaction. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices sugar on the mantel. Lady Bantry had taken charge of Mrs. Ashcombe, settling her in the sitting room with a medicinal glass of brandy. Martha Keene hovered anxiously in the hallway, wringing her hands and looking as though she might burst into tears at any moment. Mr. Pritchard had been summoned from the garden gate and now stood in the entrance hall. His smooth face creased with what might have been genuine shock. Inspector Slack had commandeered the dining room for his interviews, and Constable Polk was busily recording everything in his careful, laborious hand. Miss Marple, who had not been expressly forbidden from the morning parlor, returned there with the deliberate air of one who had forgotten her spectacles. Dr. Haydock remained by the body, making notes of his own. He glanced up as Miss Marple entered, still puzzling over it. "There are several things that strike me as peculiar," Miss Marple admitted. She moved once more to the fireplace, studying the arrangement with the absorbed attention she might have given to a particularly complex knitting pattern. The mantelpiece stood perhaps 5 feet from the ground, a generous slab of white marble supported by scrolled brackets. Upon it, the ornaments had been arranged with care, the china shepherd and shepherdess at either end, a small carriage clock in the center that showed 3 minutes past 4, and toward the back, that curious saucer with its dusting of crystalline grains. Above, the brass hook protruded from the wall at a height of some 7 feet. The 2 lengths of picture cord still hung there, and below, the heavy Regency mirror lay across poor Basil Ashcombe like a grotesque blanket. "The mirror must weigh a good 30 pounds, Haydock observed. "A direct blow from that height would certainly cause the injury we see." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And his position, Doctor, does it seem natural to you?" Haydock considered the body with professional detachment. "He appears to have been standing more or less directly beneath the mirror when it fell. His heels are planted quite firmly, as though he had been standing still rather than moving about the room." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. She bent, peering at the carpet near where the dead man's heels rested. "Is that chalk, do you suppose?" Haydock crouched beside her. There, on the dark patterned carpet, was the faintest whisker of pale blue, as though someone had made a tiny mark and then attempted to rub it away. "By Jove," Haydock said softly. "It is chalk. But what on earth?" Miss Marple straightened, her eyes traveling upward to the brass hook. "If one wished to ensure that a falling object struck a particular spot," she said thoughtfully, "one might make a small mark on the floor directly below, might one not, and perhaps a corresponding mark on the hook itself to be certain of the alignment." She produced her handkerchief, and standing on tiptoe managed to dab at the upper curve of the hook. When she examined the linen, there was indeed a faint blue smudge. "Miss Marple," Haydock said slowly, "are you suggesting this was deliberate?" "I am suggesting," she replied carefully, "that accidents which are so very precise are sometimes not accidents at all. But let us return to the matter of the sugar." She lifted the saucer once more, holding it to the light from the window. The grains caught the gray daylight and sparkled faintly. "Mrs. Ashcombe said she placed this here with hot water for her eye bath. That would account for the moisture, certainly. But look here, Doctor, at the rim. Haydock examined it closely. Sticky, he confirmed, as though something sweet had been dissolved in the water. Or as though, Miss Marple said gently, something had been held in place by a substance that dissolved in warmth and left this residue behind. Sugar dissolves in warm water, does it not? And if one were to have something like gelatine, it would first set quite hard when cool, and then soften and eventually dissolve when warmed again. Good Lord, Haydock breathed. You're thinking the mirror was deliberately released by some sort of timed mechanism. I am thinking many things, Miss Marple said, and I should like very much to examine those picture cords more closely. With Haydock's assistance, she carefully detached the 2 lengths of cord from the hook. Laid side by side on the mantelpiece, their differences became even more apparent. The left-hand cord was of an older, duller fiber. Its end frayed gradually, as rope will fray with age and use. About halfway along its length was an older cut, partially worn through but not completely severed. The right-hand cord was newer, its fibers still possessing a certain shine and stiffness, but its broken end was peculiar. The individual strands clumped together as though they had been dipped in something adhesive. Miss Marple touched the sticky end very carefully. Gelatine, she said with quiet certainty, or something very like it. See how it has dried clear and hard. If one were to prepare a syrup of sugar and gelatine, let it cool until it began to set, one could use it as a very effective temporary adhesive. It would hold firm in the cool morning air, but a little warmth, a warm fire, and perhaps a saucer of heated water placed upon the mantel would soften it within minutes. But the old cord, Haydock protested. It shows signs of wear, yes indeed. Wear from long ago, I should think. Someone cut partway through it, weeks or even months past. Enough to weaken it, but not enough to cause immediate failure. Then yesterday or today, they added this new length of cord, fixing the 2 together with their gelatine mixture. The arrangement would hold the mirror's weight when the adhesive was set. But once warmed, the bond would soften. The new cord would slip free, and down would come the mirror. She paused, studying the broken ends with an expression of deep thought. The old cord was there to provide authenticity, you see, to make it appear as though the whole thing had simply worn through with age. But the person who arranged this was not quite clever enough. They forgot that an old break and a new break look rather different. Haydock shook his head slowly. If you are right, this is cold-blooded murder. Yes, Miss Marple agreed quietly, though I suspect the murderer would prefer to think of it as a regrettable necessity. That is often how these things are justified, is it not? We convince ourselves that we have no choice, that circumstances force our hand, she sighed. Human nature, Doctor. It rarely changes, however much we might wish it otherwise. A sound from the doorway made them both turn. Inspector Slack stood there, his expression thunderous. Miss Marple, I might have known I would find you interfering. What are you about now? Miss Marple drew herself up with quiet dignity. I am about nothing, Inspector, save observing what is plainly before us. Have you had an opportunity to examine this saucer and these picture cords? Slack stumped into the room and stared at the items on the mantelpiece. Saucer, what about it? The sticky residue, Miss Marple explained patiently, and the sugar crystals, and the peculiar difference between these 2 lengths of cord. Do you not find it all rather suggestive? Suggestive of what? Slack demanded, though his tone had lost some of its belligerence. Of careful planning, Miss Marple replied. Of someone who thought through each detail with great precision. Someone who understood weights and measures, who could judge the exact moment when warmth would weaken an adhesive bond. Someone, moreover, who had access to this room and the opportunity to make preparations. She moved to the door and pointed to the faint grease mark on its upper edge. And someone who arranged matters so that this room would be locked from within after the deed was done, giving the appearance of a tragic accident in a sealed chamber. Slack's face had gone from red to a rather unhealthy purple. Locked room? But how— That, Miss Marple said gently, is what we must discover, though I confess I have my suspicions. Tell me, Inspector, did Mr. Pritchard remain at the garden gate the entire time Mr. Ashcombe was in this room? Says he did, Slack grunted. Young Tom Fletcher saw him there smoking and looking at his watch. And Martha Keene went to Pratt's shop for sugar, she says. Mr. Pratt confirmed she was there from 10 to 4 until about 12 minutes past. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. Sugar? She repeated softly. How very appropriate. And did Mr. Pratt mention any other recent purchases? I have not asked him, Slack said stiffly. Should I have done? I think, Miss Marple said, that it might prove illuminating. Picture cord, perhaps. Gelatine sheets, even a stick of blue chalk. The sort of things one might acquire if one were planning something very clever indeed. Inspector Slack stared at her for a long moment, then turned abruptly on his heel. Pal, get your coat. We're going to have a word with Mr. Pratt. As his footsteps receded down the hall, Dr. Haydock looked at Miss Marple with something approaching awe. You have worked it all out, have you not? Not quite all, Miss Marple admitted, but I begin to see the shape of it. The question now is not how it was done, but by whom, and with what purpose. I fancy that the answer to those questions will prove both sad and illuminating in equal measure. Chapter 4. 2 Chords. One cut long ago. The sitting room had taken on the subdued atmosphere peculiar to houses where death has called unexpectedly. Mrs. Ashcombe sat very upright in her chair by the fire, the brandy untouched at her elbow. Lady Bantry had drawn her own chair close and was speaking in low, comforting tones. Though what comfort could be offered in such circumstances was difficult to say. Miss Marple entered quietly, her knitting bag over her arm. She had retrieved it from where she had left it earlier, and now she settled herself in the chair by the window with the air of one who intended to stay until matters were resolved. "How are you feeling, my dear?" she asked Mrs. Ashcombe gently. "Quite well, thank you." The reply was automatic, the response of good breeding. Then, more honestly, shocked, I suppose. It seems impossible that poor Basil could be lying there dead. However disagreeable he may have been, one does not wish such an end for anyone. Certainly not, Lady Bantry agreed firmly. Though I must say, Lydia, you're bearing up remarkably well under the strain. Mrs. Ashcombe's right hand went to her eye in that gesture that was becoming familiar. My eye troubles me more than anything else, I confess. It has been painful all afternoon. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. You mentioned earlier that you had prepared an eye bath. Did you find it soothing? I had not the opportunity to use it, Mrs. Ashcombe replied. With all the commotion, you understand. I left the saucer on the mantel in the parlor when Basil demanded entrance to the room. Ah, yes, the saucer. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. With the warm water and boric powder, you said? Just so. I always prepare it with a little warmth. Cold water is rather shocking to the eye. Most sensible, Miss Marple murmured. And the eye bath itself, where might that be now? Mrs. Ashcombe looked momentarily uncertain. I believe Martha fetched it for me from my bedroom. It should be in its case, in my sewing basket, I imagine. Your sewing basket? Lady Bantry interjected. But surely it belongs in your bedroom, Lydia. A faint color touched Mrs. Ashcombe's pale cheeks. Martha must have placed it there when she was tidying. She's always moving things about, though I have asked her not to. Miss Marple rose and crossed to where a wicker sewing basket sat beside Mrs. Ashcombe's usual chair. May I? She asked, and without waiting for permission, lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged, were the usual contents of such a basket. Spools of thread, papers of pins, a silver thimble, scissors, and several pieces of work in progress. And there, tucked at the side, was a small velvet case of midnight blue. Miss Marple lifted it out and opened it carefully. The case was lined with cream satin, and nestled within was a small glass eye bath. The lining was distinctly damp, and the scent of borax solution mixed with something floral, perhaps rose water, was quite noticeable. "You've not used this recently?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Not since this morning," Mrs. Ashcombe said. Her voice had grown quieter. "I cleanse the eye then, as I do each day." Miss Marple turned the case in her hands, examining it with care. On one corner of the satin lining was a small smear, sticky to the touch. She rubbed it between finger and thumb with the same delicate motion she had used on the mantelpiece. "Sugar," she said softly. "Or syrup, perhaps." The silence that followed this observation was profound. Lady Bantry looked bewildered, but Mrs. Ashcombe had gone very still indeed, her composed face showing nothing. "I cannot account for that," she said at last. "Perhaps some substance from the mantelpiece." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. She set down the case and returned to her chair, taking up her knitting once more. "It is curious, though, that the case was in your sewing basket rather than your bedroom. And curious as well that you said Martha must have placed it there, when we both know that Martha was sent to your bedroom to fetch it, and would naturally have left it where you could reach it easily, on the side table. For instance," Mrs. Ashcombe pressed her fingers to her right temple. "I am not thinking clearly. The shock, you understand?" "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "Shock affects us all differently. May I ask, does your eye pain you now?" "A little." "Yet you have made no move to use the eye bath, though it sits ready to hand." There was another silence. Outside, the gray afternoon was darkening toward evening. Somewhere in the house, Inspector Slack's voice could be heard, sharp with authority. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Ashcombe, I wonder if you would permit me to ask you a rather delicate question. Your eye, the glass one, how often do you remove it?" "Daily to clean it," Mrs. Ashcombe replied. Her voice was steady but very low. "In the morning and again before bed, and at no other time. There is no need unless it were causing discomfort." "I have grown accustomed to small discomforts," Mrs. Ashcombe said. "One learns to bear them." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, I dare say one does. And yet I noticed that your right eyelid appears somewhat reddened, as though the eye had been removed and replaced quite recently." "Within the last hour or two, I should judge," Lady Bantry gasped. "Jane, what are you implying?" But Mrs. Ashcombe said nothing at all. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. Only her breathing had quickened very slightly. Miss Marple continued in her gentle, inexorable way. "A glass eye is a small object, but it has weight. Not much, perhaps, but enough for certain purposes. A few grams, I should imagine. Dense, smooth, spherical. Rather like a small marble, in fact. And if one needed a weight for some delicate operation, something that could be retrieved afterward without trace, something that one always had to hand, well, it would serve admirably, would it not?" "You're speaking in riddles, Jane," Lady Bantry said, but her voice trembled. "Am I?" Miss Marple's blue eyes were very direct as she looked at Mrs. Ashcombe. "I think Mrs. Ashcombe understands me quite well. The picture cord weakened long ago, but not by accident. The new cord added yesterday or the day before, joined to the old by a bond of sugar and gelatine. The warmth of the fire and the heated saucer to soften that bond at precisely the right moment. And then, after the mirror fell, the small matter of the locked door, a bolt shot from outside by means of a weighted string. And what better weight than something small, dense, and always in one's possession?" Mrs. Ashcombe closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they held a curious mixture of resignation and defiance. "You're very clever, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "Too clever by half, some might say." "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple replied. Not clever, merely observant. And perhaps a little too familiar with the darker corners of human nature. But we must let Inspector Slack reach his own conclusions. I am merely an old woman with too much time for speculation. But they both knew that speculation had become certainty, and that the sad unraveling of truth had well and truly begun. Chapter 5. The Eye Case in the Sewing. Basket Martha Keene had been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hand shook as she poured fresh tea in the dining room, where Inspector Slack had temporarily suspended his interrogations to allow everyone a restorative cup. "I cannot believe it," she kept saying. "I simply cannot believe it. To think of Mr. Ashcombe lying there, and me at Pratt's shop buying sugar as though it were an ordinary day." Mr. Pritchard accepted his tea with a murmur of thanks. He had lost some of his smooth assurance and now appeared merely middle-aged and shaken. A dreadful business. Absolutely dreadful. I was standing not 20 yards away waiting by the gate. "What time did you arrive at the cottage, Mr. Pritchard?" Miss Marple inquired pleasantly. She had joined them at Inspector Slack's grudging invitation, though whether he welcomed her presence or merely accepted the inevitable was difficult to say. 3:30, perhaps a minute or two later, Pritchard replied. "Mr. Ashcombe and I traveled together from Much Benham. He went inside directly, but I remained outside. He had instructed me to wait until he called for me." "And during the time you waited, did you see anyone approach the house or leave it?" Pritchard frowned in concentration. "Mrs. Keene left by the front door shortly after we arrived. She called out that she was going to the shop and would return presently. I saw no one else until the vicar came walking up the lane, but that was later, after all the commotion had begun." Miss Marple turned to Martha. "You went to Pratt's for sugar, I understand." "Yes, miss." Martha dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Mrs. Ashcombe had asked me to prepare fresh tea, and we were running low. I left at 10 minutes to 4. By the hall clock and returned at 12 minutes. Past. Mr. Pratt will tell you the same. He remarked on the time because he was about to close for his afternoon rest." "And what did you purchase?" "A pound of granulated sugar, miss. Nothing else." "Had Mrs. Ashcombe sent you on any other errands recently?" "Yesterday, perhaps?" Martha looked puzzled. "No, miss, yesterday was my half-day. I was not here at all. This was interesting." Miss Marple filed the information away in her orderly mind. "I see. And when you returned from the shop today, where did you place the sugar?" "In the kitchen pantry, as always. You did not go into the morning parlor?" "Certainly not, miss. The door was shut, and Mr. Ashcombe was inside. I would not have dreamed of disturbing him." Inspector Slack had been listening to this exchange with mounting impatience. "What has sugar got to do with anything, Miss Marple? If you have something to say, kindly say it plainly." "I'm merely establishing the movements of everyone in the house, Inspector." "Surely that is what you yourself have been doing," Slack grunted. "What I want to know is how that door came to be bolted from the inside when the man was already dead. Dr. Haydock says death was near instantaneous. He could not have shot the bolt himself after the mirror fell." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "That would be quite impossible. Then someone else bolted it, but how? The key was in the lock on the inside. The bolt was shot, and the French window was latched. There is no other way into that room. Unless," Miss Marple suggested delicately, "the bolt was operated from outside." "From outside? That's absurd. How could anyone reach through a locked door to shoot a bolt?" "Not through the door, Inspector. Over it." Slack stared at her. "Over it?" "The grease mark on the upper edge of the door frame," Miss Marple reminded him, as though something had been drawn across it, a cord perhaps, weighted at one end. If one were to cast such a cord over the door, let the weight drop down on the inside and then manipulate it carefully, One might be able to catch the weight behind the bolt and pull it closed. Pritchard leaned forward with sudden interest. But what sort of weight could do such a thing? It would need to be small enough to maneuver, yet heavy enough to slide the bolt. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Something very small and very dense. A lead fishing weight, possibly. Or a large ball bearing. Or perhaps something even more ingenious. She glanced at Mrs. Ashcombe, who had entered the room silently and now stood in the doorway. The widow's face was pale but composed, and her right hand no longer strayed to her temple. "I wonder, Mrs. Ashcombe," Miss Marple continued gently, "if I might examine your sewing basket once more. There is something I should like to verify." "By all means," Mrs. Ashcombe's voice was steady. They returned to the sitting room, a small procession of 5 people bound by curiosity and dread. Miss Marple reopened the blue velvet case and examined it with minute attention. The damp satin lining, the faint smell of rose water and borax solution, the sticky corner that had caught her notice before. "Martha," she said, "you fetched this case from Mrs. Ashcombe's bedroom, did you not?" "Yes, miss. From the dressing table, just as Mrs. Ashcombe asked." "And you brought it directly to her?" "I brought it to the sitting room." "Yes, but Mrs. Ashcombe was busy with the tea things. I set it on the side table there by her chair, not in the sewing basket." "No, miss. Why would I put it in the basket?" Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Ashcombe. "And yet it was in the basket when I looked. You said Martha must have placed it there, but now we learn that she did not." "How curious." Mrs. Ashcombe said nothing. Her silence was more eloquent than any protestation might have been. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that you placed it there yourself, Mrs. Ashcombe, after you had used it. Not for your eye, but for another purpose entirely. The case is damp because you rinsed the eye bath after use, and the sticky residue is there because you handled the case with fingers that had touched the gelatine mixture. You put it away hastily in the nearest receptacle, which happened to be your sewing basket." Inspector Slack had turned an interesting shade of purple. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Ashcombe's glass eye is mixed up in all this?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that it would make an ideal weight for operating a bolt from outside a locked door. Small, dense, smooth, and always to hand. One would need only to wrap it in a protective cloth, attach it to a waxed thread, cast it over the door, and manipulate it into position. Afterward, one could retrieve both thread and weight, burn the cloth, clean the eye, and replace it where it belonged, a matter of moments, provided one had steady nerves and clever fingers." She looked at Mrs. Ashcombe with compassion. "And you, my dear, are renowned in the village for your needlework, for your perfect stitch and steady hand. Is that not so?" Mrs. Ashcombe met her gaze directly. For a long moment she said nothing, and in that silence hung the weight of truth acknowledged. Then very softly she said, "You seem to have thought of everything, Miss Marple." "Not everything," Miss Marple replied. "Not yet, but I believe we're approaching an understanding." Chapter 6. A Grease Mark. Over the door. Inspector Slack had recovered from his initial shock and was now exhibiting the dogged determination that made him, despite his limitations, a reasonably effective policeman. He summoned Constable Polk, and together they returned to the morning parlor for a more thorough examination. Miss Marple accompanied them, as did Dr. Haydock. Lady Bantry remained with Mrs. Ashcombe in the sitting room, though what comfort she could offer was becoming increasingly doubtful. "Now then," Slack said, positioning himself before the door. "You say there is a grease mark, Miss Marple. Show me." Miss Marple indicated the outer top edge of the door frame. In the fading afternoon light it was barely visible, but when Slack ran his own handkerchief along the wood, it came away with a faint gray smudge. Graphite, he muttered. Or pencil lead mixed with grease, the sort of thing you get on machinery or from rubbing against a blackened surface. Or, Miss Marple suggested, from a cord that has been treated with wax and passed over wood repeatedly. Black wax. Perhaps mixed with a little graphite to make it slide smoothly. Slack looked at her sharply. You are thinking of the bolt mechanism again. I'm thinking of practicalities, Inspector. If one wished to operate a bolt from outside a locked room, one would need a cord strong enough to pull it, smooth enough to slide easily, and dark enough not to show marks. Black silk thread treated with dark wax would serve admirably. She moved to the skirting board near the door hinges and bent down with some difficulty, her joints protesting the movement. And here, I think, is where the thread end fell when it was cut or broken. Slack crouched beside her. There, caught against the base of the skirting, was a short length of black silk thread, perhaps 2 inches long. It was slightly stiff to the touch, as though treated with some substance, and one end showed a clean break. Waxed, Haydock confirmed, examining it under the better light from the window. And look here. There is a tiny fragment of something else adhering to it. Muslin, I should say, or some other fine fabric. The wrapping for the weight, Miss Marple said quietly. One would not wish to damage or mark the object being used. A small square of muslin would protect it admirably. Slack had gone to the fireplace and was now poking through the ashes with the fire iron. The coals had burned low, but there was still warmth in the grate. Among the gray ash and blackened cinders, something caught his eye. Polk, bring that evidence bag. He used the iron to lift out a fragment of partially burned fabric. It was fine weave muslin, perhaps 3 inches square, with one corner charred to ash, but the rest still recognizable. And along one edge, very faintly, was a pale pink stain. What on earth? Slack held it up to the light. Dr. Haydock took it from him carefully. That pink color is familiar. Let me see. He sniffed at the fabric delicately. Boric solution mixed with rose water, unless I am much mistaken. The very mixture one might use for bathing the eyes. Mrs. Ashcombe's eye bath solution, Miss Marple said, which she prepared this afternoon. The muslin would have absorbed a little of the solution if the glass eye had been rinsed before being wrapped. And then after the bolt was shot and the eye retrieved, the muslin would be evidence best. Destroyed. Slack was beginning to look like a man who had bitten into what he thought was a ripe apple, only to find it thoroughly wormed. You're telling me that Mrs. Lydia Ashcombe, a respectable widow and church warden, murdered her brother-in-law by dropping a mirror on his head and then locked the door using her own glass eye as a weight? I am telling you nothing, Inspector, Miss Marple replied with dignity. I am merely pointing out what the evidence suggests. What you make of it is entirely your own affair. But Slack was thorough when he chose to be. He sent Polk to fetch Mrs. Ashcombe's work bag from the sitting room, and when it arrived, they examined its contents with care. The bag yielded several interesting items. There was the usual sewing paraphernalia, needles, pins, thread in various colors, and a small pair of scissors with mother-of-pearl handles. But there was also a cake of beeswax, the kind used to strengthen thread and make it glide smoothly through fabric. The wax was yellow, but across its surface someone had drawn a dark line, as though testing the color after mixing it with something else. Graphite? Perhaps, or lampblack. For darkening the wax, Miss Marple observed, so that a treated thread would not show white against dark wood. In the bottom of the bag, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small spool of black silk thread. It was fine but strong, the sort used for delicate embroidery or button sewing. When Slack held the thread end from the skirting against the spool, they matched exactly. She is a needlewoman, Haydock said slowly. One of the finest in the county. Those altar cloths in the church, the ones everyone admires. Those are her work. She has the skill and the patience for the sort of precise manipulation. Slack sat back on his heels, the evidence spread before him. But why? Why would a woman like Mrs. Ashcombe commit murder? What possible reason could she have? That, Miss Marple said, is perhaps the most important question of all. And I suspect the answer lies not in what we have discovered here, but in what Basil Ashcombe intended to do. Martha mentioned that he was threatening evictions. Mr. Pritchard spoke of rationalizations and new leases. But I wonder if there was something more. Something that touched Mrs. Ashcombe more directly. She paused, choosing her words with care. When a person of good character commits a desperate act, it is usually because they feel cornered, trapped with no alternative. Basil Ashcombe was a bully. We know that much. But what hold did he have over his sister-in-law? What threat was so terrible that murder seemed the only escape? Slack rose to his feet, dusting off his trousers. Then I shall ask her directly. No more hints and suggestions, Miss Marple. If Mrs. Ashcombe is guilty of this crime, she will have to answer for it in plain English. Of course, Miss Marple agreed. But you might also wish to speak with Mr. Pratt first. I believe you intended to ask him about recent purchases. Slack had the grace to look slightly abashed. Polk, you stay here and keep watch. Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple, you will accompany me to the shop. I want witnesses to whatever Pratt has to say. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced back at the morning parlor. The mirror still lay where it had fallen. The cord end still dangled from the hook, and the saucer with its telltale crystals still rested on the mantelpiece. It was a room that had been carefully prepared for death, and death had come precisely as planned. But murder, as Miss Marple well knew, always left traces. The cleverest killer could not think of everything, could not erase every mark or hide every clue. Human beings were fallible creatures, prone to small oversights and tiny errors. And it was those small things, those tiny mistakes, that always told the tale in the end. She followed Inspector Slack out into the gray November evening, her mind already working through the remaining pieces of the puzzle. The picture was nearly complete now. Only the motive remained obscure, and she suspected that when it was revealed, it would prove both tragic and entirely comprehensible. Human nature, after all, was remarkably consistent. The circumstances might change, but the fundamental drives, fear, greed, desperation, remained constant throughout the ages. And St. Mary Mead, for all its pastoral charm, was no more immune to human weakness than anywhere else in the world. Chapter 7. Gelatine Sheets and Picture Cord. Pratt and Giais. Son occupied a corner position on the High Street, a shop that had served St. Mary Mead for 3 generations. It sold everything from bootlaces to writing paper, from patent medicines to seeds for the garden. Mr. Pratt himself was a thin, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an excellent memory for transactions. He looked up from his account books as the bell above the door jangled, and his expression suggested that a visit from the police was not entirely welcome at closing time. Inspector Slack, he said with cautious politeness. How may I assist you? Information, Mr. Pratt. Slack removed his hat and set it on the counter. I understand that Mrs. Keene came in this afternoon to purchase sugar. Can you confirm the time? Certainly. It was 10 minutes to 4 when she arrived, and she left at 12 minutes past. I remember particularly because I was preparing to close for my rest period at 1:15. Did she purchase anything besides sugar? No, Inspector. Simply 1 pound of granulated sugar. And in the days previous, yesterday perhaps, did anyone from Ivy Cottage make other purchases? Mr. Pratt adjusted his spectacles and consulted a ledger that lay open on the counter. Let me see. Yesterday, Tuesday the 5th, we had no customers from Ivy Cottage. Mrs. Ashcombe herself came in on Monday afternoon. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. Monday afternoon? Can you recall what she purchased, Mr. Pratt? The shopkeeper's brow furrowed in concentration. It was an unusual order, which is why it remains in my mind. She requested gelatine sheets, the kind used for making jellies and aspics, 2 sheets, if I recall correctly. She also purchased picture cord, the strong braided type, perhaps 2 yards of it, and a stick of blue chalk, the sort children use on slate boards. Inspector Slack's eyes had narrowed. Did she say what the items were for? She mentioned something about making calf's foot jelly and needing to repair a picture frame. The chalk, I assumed, was for marking measurements. She has always been a lady who attends to household matters with great precision. I see. Slack made a note in his pocketbook. And her manner, Mr. Pratt? Was it in any way unusual? Not at all, Inspector. Mrs. Ashcombe is invariably courteous and composed. She made her purchases, paid in cash, and departed. There was nothing remarkable about the transaction. Miss Marple spoke again, her voice gentle but interested. Had she ever purchased such items before? The gelatine and picture cord together, I mean? Mr. Pratt considered this carefully. Not that I can recall, Miss Marple. We sell gelatine fairly regularly, of course, especially in the winter months when people make jelly dishes, but picture cord less frequently. I cannot remember Mrs. Ashcombe ever buying both items on the same occasion. Thank you, Mr. Pratt, Slack said heavily. You have been most helpful. If you remember anything else, anything at all about Mrs. Ashcombe's visit or her manner, I trust you will inform me immediately. Of course, Inspector. They emerged into the dusk. Street lamps were beginning to glow along the high street, and a few early stars showed pale against the darkening sky. Dr. Haydock pulled his coat more tightly about him against the November chill. So she purchased the materials on Monday, he said quietly. That suggests premeditation, careful planning. It suggests a great deal more than that, Miss Marple replied. It suggests someone who understood exactly what would be required, and who took care to acquire everything well in advance. Gelatine sheets can be melted into a syrup with sugar and water. When cooled, such a mixture sets firm, but warmth will soften it again within minutes. Picture cord of the strong variety would be needed to support the weight of a heavy mirror, at least temporarily. And the blue chalk? Miss Marple said simply. For marking, a small mark on the hook to ensure the mirror hung at precisely the correct angle, and perhaps a corresponding mark on the floor to indicate where the victim should stand. When murder is dressed up as accident, precision becomes paramount. They walked slowly back toward Ivy Cottage, each occupied with their own thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with inexorable logic. The weakened cord, cut long ago, the new cord joined to it with dissolvable adhesive. The warmth of fire and heated saucer to trigger the mechanism at the chosen moment, and afterward the locked door created by means of a weighted thread cast over the doorframe, with a glass eye serving as the perfect retrievable weight. It was, Miss Marple reflected, quite ingenious in its way, the sort of plan that required both intelligence and nerve, as well as particular skills in needlework and household chemistry. Mrs. Ashcombe possessed all these qualities in abundance. But why? That remained the central question, the one piece that did not yet fit cleanly into the pattern. When they returned to the cottage, they found Lady Bantry in the hall, her face drawn with distress. Jane, you must speak with her. She sits there saying nothing, staring at the fire. I have tried to comfort her, but what comfort can there be? None at all, I fear, Miss Marple said gently. Where is Constable Polk? In the morning parlor, standing guard as instructed. The vicar came, but Inspector Slack sent him away. He said no one was to disturb the scene until you returned. They found Mrs. Ashcombe exactly as Lady Bantry had described, sitting upright in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, gazing into the flames. She did not look up as they entered. "Mrs. Ashcombe," Inspector Slack said formally, "I must ask you some questions about a purchase you made on Monday afternoon at Pratt & Son." "I remember the purchase." Her voice was steady, almost detached. "Gelatine sheets, picture cord, and blue chalk." "And what did you intend to do with these items?" For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her face was pale but composed, and her eyes, the real one and the glass one, reflected the firelight with equal steadiness. "I think you know, Inspector. Miss Marple has certainly deduced it. There seems little point in pretense." Slack drew a breath. "Mrs. Ashcombe, I must caution you that anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly." "Then I am asking you directly. Did you on this day, Wednesday, the 6th of November, deliberately cause the death of your brother-in-law, Basil Ashcombe?" The silence stretched out, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Miss Marple stood very still, watching the woman before her with compassion and sadness in equal measure. At last, Mrs. Ashcombe spoke. "Yes, Inspector, I did. I arranged for the mirror to fall upon him at a predetermined time, and I secured the room afterward to suggest an accident. I planned it carefully over several weeks, and I executed it this afternoon exactly as I had designed." Lady Bantry gave a small cry of distress, but Mrs. Ashcombe continued in that same level, almost detached tone. "I do not ask for mercy or understanding. I knew what I was doing. I weighed the consequences and found them preferable to the alternative. That is all I wish to say at present." Inspector Slack's face had gone rigid. "Mrs. Lydia Ashcombe, I am arresting you for the willful murder of Basil Ashcombe. You will accompany me to the station, where you will be formally charged." "Of course." She rose with dignity, reaching for her coat. "May I have a moment to collect a few necessities?" "Pock will accompany you." As Mrs. Ashcombe left the room under escort, Miss Marple turned to Inspector Slack. "You will need to know why, Inspector. A confession without understanding serves no one." "Then she'd better provide that understanding," Slack said grimly, "because unless there are extraordinary circumstances, she will hang for this." Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression suggested that she believed those circumstances might indeed prove extraordinary, if only someone took the trouble to uncover them. Chapter 8. Alibi by Tea Tray and Garden Gate. The police station at Much Benham was a square brick building that had seen better days. Inspector Slack's office was small and cluttered, with a desk piled high with papers and 2 uncomfortable wooden chairs for visitors. Mrs. Ashcombe sat in one of these chairs, still wearing her coat, her hands resting quietly on her handbag. Miss Marple had insisted on accompanying them, and Inspector Slack, recognizing that the old lady might prove useful in extracting the full story, had reluctantly agreed. Dr. Haydock had come as well, concerned for Mrs. Ashcombe's health under the strain. "Now then," Slack began, settling himself behind his desk. "You have confessed to murder, Mrs. Ashcombe. Before we proceed further, I want to establish the precise timeline of events this afternoon. Where was everyone, and when?" Mrs. Ashcombe inclined her head slightly. "I can tell you exactly, Inspector. I planned everything with considerable care." She spoke without emotion, as though recounting the details of a recipe. Basil and Mr. Pritchard arrived at 3. Basil came inside while Mr. Pritchard remained at the garden gate as instructed. Lady Bantry and Miss Marple were already in the sitting room, having arrived some minutes earlier. And Martha Keene. Martha laid the tea tray at 10 minutes to 4. I'd asked her earlier to go to Pratt's for sugar when she had finished, knowing it would take her out of the house for the critical period. She left at precisely that time, 10 to 4. 10 to 4, Slack repeated, making notes. And Basil Ashcombe went into the morning parlor. When? At 5 minutes to 4. I suggested he take a few minutes to review the papers in private. He was always more tractable after a brief period of solitary reflection. Miss Marple stirred slightly. And the fire in the parlor, it was already burning. I had lit it at 3 when I knew they would arrive soon. The room needed to be warm. Mrs. Ashcombe's mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile, sufficiently warm to soften gelatine within minutes. The saucer on the mantelpiece, Miss Marple said gently. You did not prepare it for your eye, did you? No. I filled it with water I had heated in the kettle, added a spoonful of the sugar and gelatine mixture to help it dissolve, and placed it on the mantel. The combination of the fire's heat from below and the warm liquid from above would soften the bond holding the mirror cord within 10 to 12 minutes. Calculated precisely, Haydock observed. Everything was calculated, Doctor. I had practiced the timing several times over the past week, using a similar saucer, and testing how long it took for the adhesive to give way. Basil's habits were predictable. He always stood in one place when reading, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I marked that spot with chalk, then arranged the mirror so it would fall directly there. Inspector Slack leaned forward. What about the bolt on the door? How did you manage that? While Martha was at the shop and everyone else was in the sitting room, I heard the mirror fall. The sound was quite distinctive. I waited 30 seconds to be certain, then excused myself, saying I needed to fetch something from my work bag. I went into the corridor, drew my weighted thread from my pocket, and cast it over the door. Her voice remained steady, matter-of-fact. It took 3 attempts before the weight, wrapped in muslin, fell into the correct position behind the bolt. Then I pulled firmly and the bolt slid home. The thread was waxed and treated with graphite to make it slide smoothly over the wood. I retrieved the weight, removed the muslin wrapping, rinsed my eye, and replaced it, then burned the muslin in the sitting room fire while pretending to adjust the coals. Your gloves, Miss Marple said. You were wearing gloves? Yes. The right thumb picked up a grain of sugar from the saucer when I placed it. The left acquired the grease mark when I steadied myself against the door frame while casting the thread. Small oversights, but unavoidable given the circumstances. Slack sat back, his face a mixture of anger and reluctant admiration. You thought of everything. Not quite everything, Inspector. I did not anticipate Miss Marple's powers of observation. Mrs. Ashcombe turned to look at the elderly lady. When did you know? I suspected from the moment I saw the 2 different cord ends, Miss Marple replied. But I was certain only when I examined your eye case and saw the damp lining and the sugar smear. The redness of your eyelid confirmed that you had removed and replaced your eye recently. After that, it was simply a matter of understanding how all the pieces fit together. And you could not let it rest. No, Miss Marple said quietly. Truth has a way of demanding recognition, no matter how inconvenient. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. We have established how the murder was committed, and that you alone had the opportunity to carry it out. Mr. Pritchard was at the garden gate throughout, witnessed by young Tom Fletcher. Martha was at Pratt's shop. Lady Bantry and Miss Marple were together in the sitting room. You were the only person who moved about the house unobserved. Quite correct. Then we come to the essential question. Why, Mrs. Ashcombe? What drove you to such an extreme measure? For the first time, emotion flickered across Mrs. Ashcombe's face. Her composure wavered, and her hand went to her right eye in that characteristic gesture of distress. He was going to destroy everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just evict me from Ivy Cottage, though that would have been hard enough. He had discovered something about my late husband's death, something that was not true, but which he threatened to make public unless I signed over my trust fund to him. Your husband died in an accident. Did he not? Dr. Haydock asked gently. He died in a motor car crash 12 years ago. The inquest ruled it accidental death, but Basil claimed to have evidence, witnesses who would say that I had tampered with the brakes. It was a lie, a vicious lie. But he would have spread it through the courts and the newspapers. My reputation would have been destroyed. My husband's memory tainted. And even if I were cleared, the scandal would have followed me forever. Tears stood in her eyes now, though she did not let them fall. More than that, he was going to evict young Millie Hope, turn her out with her baby, simply because the child cried at night. He was going to raise rents throughout the village, force out half a dozen families who depend on his cottages. He took pleasure in cruelty, Inspector. He enjoyed wielding power over those weaker than himself. So you decided to stop him? I decided that the world would be better without him in it, she said simply. I do not ask you to approve or understand. I knew it was murder. I knew I would be caught eventually. But I also knew that if I did nothing, many people would suffer. So I chose to act. Inspector Slack's expression had softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. The law does not permit us to take justice into our own hands, Mrs. Ashcombe, no matter how righteous we believe our cause. I know that, Inspector. I have never claimed righteousness, only necessity. She straightened in her chair. I am prepared to face the consequences of my actions. I ask only that you verify Basil's threats, speak with his solicitor, examine his papers. You will find that everything I have said is true. Miss Marple looked at the woman before her with deep sadness. She had seen this pattern before, the collision of human weakness and human desperation, the terrible moment when an ordinary person chose an extraordinary path. There are always alternatives, she said softly, though sometimes we cannot see them until it is too late. Perhaps, Mrs. Ashcombe replied. But I saw only one way forward, and I took it. That is all there is to say. Chapter 9. Muslin Ash with a Pink Stain. The following morning brought cold rain to St. Mary Mead, the sort of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into one's bones. Miss Marple sat in her own cottage, a pot of tea growing cold at her elbow, turning over the events of the previous day in her mind. Dr. Whodunit called at 10, shaking the rain from his hat in the hallway. I have just come from the station, he said without preamble. Mrs. Ashcombe spent a quiet night, though she ate nothing. She's asked to see you, Miss Marple. Has she indeed? Miss Marple set down her knitting. Did she say why? She wishes to explain certain details more fully. Inspector Slack has agreed, though he insists on being present. I think he hopes you might extract information that he cannot. They drove to Much Benham through the rain, the windscreen wipers beating a steady rhythm. The station seemed even more dismal in the gray morning light, its bricks dark with moisture. Mrs. Ashcombe looked much as she had the previous evening, composed, but weary. The cell was small and spare, furnished only with a narrow bed and a wooden chair. She sat on the bed, her hands folded, and rose when Miss Marple entered. It was kind of you to come, she said quietly. I could hardly refuse, Miss Marple replied, though I confess I am uncertain what more I can offer you. Understanding, perhaps, or at least clarity. Mrs. Ashcombe gestured to the chair. Please sit. This may take some time. Inspector Slack positioned himself near the door, notebook ready. Dr. Whodunit stood beside him. Watchful, I have spent the night reflecting, Mrs. Ashcombe began, on all the small things that led to your discovery of the truth. I should like to understand where I erred, not from any hope of avoiding justice, but simply to know. You mentioned the muslin ash in the fireplace. How did that point to me? Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably. The pink stain was the crucial element. Dr. Whodunit identified it as boric solution mixed with rose water, the precise mixture you use for your eye bath. When I learned that the muslin had been burned in the sitting room fire, rather than the morning parlor, where one might expect any debris to be disposed of. It became clear that someone had carried it from one room to the other. "I had no opportunity to burn it elsewhere," Mrs. Ashcombe said. "Martha might have returned at any moment." "Quite so. And the muslin itself was necessary because a glass eye, while robust, is not indestructible. The painted surface could be marked or chipped if used directly as a weight. Wrapping it protected both the eye and prevented any sound of glass against metal when manipulating the bolt. I rinsed the eye afterward," Mrs. Ashcombe said, "but the muslin had already absorbed some of the solution. I should have burned it more thoroughly." "Fire is an unreliable destroyer of evidence," Miss Marple observed. "It often leaves just enough to tell the tale." The fragment that remained showed not only the pink stain, but also a trace of saline crystal, the very substance found in eye bath solutions. "The combination was quite specific," Dr. Haydock spoke up. "The dampness of the eye case lining troubled me. If you had not used the eye bath that afternoon, as you claimed, why would it be damp?" "Because I rinsed the eye in it after using it as a weight," Mrs. Ashcombe replied. "I could hardly replace it without cleaning it first. My hands were sticky from handling the saucer, which is how the sugar residue came to be on the case." Another oversight. Inspector Slack had been listening with a frown. "What I want to know is how you practiced this scheme without being discovered. You said you tested the timing several times." "I did so on days when I was alone in the cottage. Martha has her half-day on Tuesdays, and there are occasional afternoons when I have no callers. I would prepare the adhesive mixture, test how long it took to soften under various conditions, and perfect my technique with the weighted thread. The bolt on the morning parlor door is old and stiff. It required considerable practice to learn the exact angle and force needed to slide it home from outside." "And the weakening of the original cord?" Miss Marple asked. "That was done some time ago, I think. 3 weeks past. I made a small cut halfway through during the night when no one could observe me. The cord was old, and I judged that a partial cut would appear as natural wear. Then I left it, allowing time to pass so that no one would connect any later accident with my actions." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That was clever. The weathering of the cut made it seem authentic, but you could not weather the new cord, which is why the two ends look so different when examined together. I thought the gelatine adhesive would disguise that difference," Mrs. Ashcombe admitted. "I assumed the cords would separate cleanly, with the old one appearing to have frayed through entirely. I did not anticipate that someone would examine the broken end so closely." "Most people would not have done," Miss Marple said gently. "But I have found over many years that small inconsistencies often reveal large truths. 2 cords of different character, joined without any visible means of joining, suggested something more than simple wear." Mrs. Ashcombe was silent for a moment. "There is one thing I do not understand. How did you know that the bolt could be operated from outside the door? Until I demonstrated the method, no one had suggested such a thing was possible." "The grease told me," Miss Marple replied. "It was too deliberate, too clean to be accidental. Something had been drawn repeatedly over that surface. Something treated with a substance that left a faint dark trail." A weighted cord was the obvious answer. And once I understood that, I had to ask myself what weight would be small enough to manipulate, heavy enough to be effective, and immediately available to the person who arranged the scheme. "And you thought of my eye?" "Not immediately," Miss Marple confessed. "But when I saw the case in your sewing basket, damp and sticky, and noticed the redness of your eyelid suggesting recent removal, the pieces came together. A glass eye is dense and heavy for its size, perfectly spherical, and always in your possession. It was, in its way, the ideal instrument for your purpose." Mrs. Ashcombe looked down at her hands. "I never imagined that something so personal, so much a part of my daily existence, would become evidence against me." There is a certain irony in that. There often is in such matters, Miss Marple said. We use what is familiar to us, what we know and trust, but familiarity can betray us. Inspector Slack shifted his weight. Is there anything else you wish to tell us, Mrs. Ashcombe? Any detail we have missed? I think Miss Marple has understood it all, Mrs. Ashcombe replied. Every step, every calculation, every small error that led to discovery. I have nothing to add except this. I regret the necessity, but not the act itself. Basil Ashcombe was a wicked man who took pleasure in causing suffering. The world is better without him. That is not for you to judge, Slack said sternly. Perhaps not, Inspector. But I judged nonetheless, and I acted on that judgment. Now I shall face the consequences. Miss Marple rose from her chair, a profound sadness in her eyes. I wish you had come to me, or to someone, before taking such a step. There are always other ways, other solutions. Are there? Mrs. Ashcombe's voice held a note of challenge. What would you have done, Miss Marple, in my circumstances? When faced with ruin and the suffering of innocence, what alternative would you have chosen? It was a question Miss Marple could not answer, and she did not try. She simply inclined her head and moved toward the door, leaving Mrs. Ashcombe to her solitary contemplation of the choice she had made. Chapter 10. Parlor. Mirror, sugar, and the widow's weight. 3 days had passed since Mrs. Ashcombe's arrest, and St. Mary Mead had spoken of little else. The vicar had delivered a sermon on the perils of taking justice into one's own hands, though his heart had not seemed quite in it. Martha Keene had wept inconsolably and declared she would never forgive herself for leaving the house at that crucial moment, though everyone assured her she bore no blame whatsoever. On Saturday afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor. Inspector Slack appeared at her door, hat in hand, looking rather less certain of himself than usual. Miss Marple, he said gruffly, I wonder if you might spare me a few moments. Of course, Inspector. Do come in. I was just about to have tea. They settled in her sitting room, the tea things arranged between them. Rain still pattered against the windows, and the fire burned cheerfully in the grate. I have come, Slack began, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigor, to acknowledge that you were right in every particular. The chief constable has examined the evidence, and he agrees that Mrs. Ashcombe's guilt is beyond question. I take no pleasure in being right, Miss Marple said quietly. No, I don't suppose you do. Slack set down his cup. But I thought you should know that we found Basil Ashcombe's papers. They were hidden in his motor car, tucked under the seat. The draft lease he brought with him was there, along with other documents. And were his threats genuine? Slack's face darkened. Entirely fabricated, as Mrs. Ashcombe suspected. He had no evidence whatsoever regarding her husband's death. The witnesses he claimed to have did not exist. It was pure blackmail, designed to frighten her into surrendering her trust fund. As for the evictions, he had drawn up notices for no fewer than 6 families, including young Mrs. Hope. So she was correct in her assessment of his character. She was. But that does not excuse murder, Miss Marple. The law exists precisely to prevent people from taking such matters into their own hands. I quite agree, Inspector, Miss Marple replied, pouring more tea. Though I cannot help but feel a measure of sympathy for her position. To be threatened with ruin based on lies, to see vulnerable people about to be cast out, all to satisfy one man's greed, it must have seemed intolerable. Even so, she should have come to the police. And what would you have done? Basil Ashcombe had broken no law until he actually proceeded with his threats. You could not have arrested him for intentions, however wicked. Slack shifted uncomfortably. That may be true, but murder is still murder. Indeed it is, Miss Marple agreed, and she has never denied it. She knew exactly what she was doing and accepted the consequences. In a strange way, Inspector, I believe she planned to be caught eventually. Why else would she have agreed to that tea with witnesses present? She could have arranged the accident for a time when she was entirely alone. This thought had clearly not occurred to Slack. You think she wanted to be discovered? I think she wanted the truth about Basil Ashcombe to be known. A simple accident would have been investigated briefly and then forgotten. But a murder, particularly one so cleverly arranged, would draw attention to his character and his schemes. By confessing and explaining her reasons, she has ensured that his wickedness is a matter of public record, a high price to pay for vindication. Perhaps she judged it worth the cost. Miss Marple gazed into the fire. Human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they believe themselves to be acting for a greater good. Right or wrong, Mrs. Ashcombe saw herself as protecting others. That belief gave her the courage to do what she did. Slack was quiet for a moment. The chief constable has asked me to commend you formally for your assistance in solving this case. Without your observations, we might well have ruled it an accident. I observed only what was there to be seen, Miss Marple replied. The sugar crystals, the different cord ends, the grease mark, the pink-stained muslin. Each small thing told part of the story. Together, they revealed the whole. The glass eye, Slack said, shaking his head. I still cannot quite believe it. Using one's own eye as a murder weapon. Not a weapon, Inspector. An instrument. There is a difference. Mrs. Ashcombe did not strike anyone with it. She used it as one would use any small weight in a mechanical operation. That she chose something so personal speaks to both desperation and ingenuity. You sound almost admiring. I admire her skill and intelligence, Miss Marple said carefully. But I do not admire the use to which she put them. Murder diminishes us all, however justified we may believe it to be. Once we permit ourselves to decide who deserves to live and who deserves to die, we step onto a very dangerous path indeed. Then you believe she should hang? Miss Marple set down her teacup with a slight tremor in her hand. I believe she should face justice according to the law. What form that justice takes is not for me to say, but I hope, Inspector, that those who judge her will take into account the provocation she faced and the lives she may have saved by removing Basil Ashcombe from the world. The GR's law does not generally view murder as an acceptable form of social reform. No, Miss Marple agreed softly. But the law is administered by human beings, and human beings are capable of mercy as well as judgment. We shall have to wait and see which prevails. Slack rose to leave, settling his hat on his head. You've given me much to think about, Miss Marple. This case has been unlike any I've handled before. Most cases involving human nature are complicated, Inspector. We like to think in terms of clear right and wrong, guilty and innocent, but reality is often more nuanced than our categories allow. After he'd gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the fire, her knitting lying idle in her lap. She thought of Mrs. Ashcombe in her cell, composed and unrepentant. She thought of Basil Ashcombe, whose cruelty had brought about his own destruction. And she thought of all the small, overlooked details that had unraveled a carefully planned murder. The sugar and gelatine holding the mirror cord, the blue chalk marking the fatal spot, the waxed thread cast over the door, the muslin wrapper burned but not quite destroyed, the damp eye case with its sticky residue, and most damning of all, the glass eye, itself that intimate instrument of a desperate woman's deadly purpose, Lady. Bantry called later that afternoon, and together they discussed the case in low voices. I cannot believe Lydia did such a thing, Dolly said for perhaps the 12th time. She was always so gentle, so kind. Gentle people can be driven to extreme acts, Miss Marple replied, especially when they perceive no alternative. Mrs. Ashcombe saw herself as trapped, with her honor and livelihood at stake. and with innocent people depending on her action. Do you think she will be convicted? I think that's inevitable. She's confessed and the evidence is overwhelming, but the circumstances may weigh in her favor when it comes to sentencing. Much will depend on public sympathy and the judge's interpretation of provocation. Poor Lydia, Lady Bantry whispered. Her eyes, Jane, to think of it being used in such a way. Miss Marple folded her knitting with careful precision. An instrument, Dolly, no more than the gelatine or the cord or the muslin. What made it significant was not the object itself, but the intent behind its use and the tiny things, the small oversights that revealed that intent to anyone willing to look closely enough. Will you visit her before the trial? I think not, Miss Marple said quietly. I have nothing to offer her now except platitudes, and she deserves better than that. She made her choice with full knowledge of the consequences. The least I can do is respect her dignity by allowing her to face those consequences without unwanted sympathy. As the gray afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple sat alone once more, contemplating the curious case of the widow with the glass eye. It had been a clever crime, meticulously planned and skillfully executed. But cleverness, as she had learned long ago, was never quite enough. The small things always told, the sticky saucer, the mismatched cords, the pink-stained ash. In the end, it was not the grand scheme that betrayed Mrs. Ashcombe, but the tiny details she could not quite control. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was endlessly fascinating and endlessly fallible. And in St. Mary Mead, as everywhere else in the world,